Listen closely. I am Daniel Cave, and what is currently unfolding is a systematic five-alarm assault on the bedrock of American democracy, a sitting president demanding the criminalization of the very judges who dared to rule against him. The magnitude of this moment cannot be overstated, as a seismic legal earthquake has just struck the Capitol, sending shockwaves through the highest levels of government. This is undeniably a massive, staggering blow to the president and his signature economic agenda, arriving at a critical juncture. What makes this particularly stunning is that the monumental defeat was handed down by a conservative-leaning Supreme Court, an institution that has traditionally been highly sympathetic to this president and his overarching policy goals. In a definitive, sweeping ruling, the Supreme Court has unequivocally declared that the president's use of IEEPA, the foundational law he relied upon to unilaterally impose 5 broad categories of global tariffs, is entirely unconstitutional for that specific purpose. The justices firmly concluded that Congress fundamentally never granted the executive branch the authority to weaponize this law for taxation. What is happening at this very second goes profoundly deeper than a few angry social media posts complaining about an unfair legal defeat. The president is not simply venting his frustration over a group of judges who happen to rule against his administration. He is not just expressing the standard, disappointed criticism that any ordinary defendant might direct at an unfavorable court decision. What we are witnessing is a deeply calculated, relentlessly sustained, and unprecedentedly dangerous assault on American democratic institutions. This is a deliberate, organized, and methodically executed public relations campaign designed to convince the American populace that federal judges who oppose him are not merely legally incorrect, they are outright criminals. He is actively painting them as corrupt, rogue actors who have fundamentally abused their judicial positions. The narrative being pushed is that these judges are enemies of the people, individuals who do not just deserve harsh public criticism, but active punishment and severe personal consequences simply for having the audacity to apply the law equally to everyone, regardless of their political power or who the defendant happens to be. The truly chilling aspect of this intimidation campaign is the slow, patient nature of its execution. This is not a flashy courthouse spectacle meant to grab headlines for a single day, burning bright and fading quickly. This is an insidious, strategically designed long game aimed at doing permanent, irreversible damage to the very institutions that stand as the final barrier between standard executive power and absolute, unchecked authority. This deliberate effort should terrify any American who understands that an independent judiciary is not a political inconvenience, but the ultimate safeguard between the rule of law and the rule of one single man. Returning to the mechanics of the ruling regarding the invoked tariffs, the exact wording used by Chief Justice John Roberts in his majority opinion is vital to understand. He explicitly wrote that IEEPA's grant of authority to regulate importation completely falls short of authorizing these financial levies. Roberts pointed out that IEEPA contains absolutely no reference to tariffs or duties. Furthermore, he noted that the government could not present a single historical statute where Congress utilized the specific word regulate as a backdoor to authorize taxation. The Chief Justice concluded that, until this administration, no president in American history has ever interpreted IEEPA to confer such vast taxing power. The central debate inside the courtroom fiercely revolved around the definition of the word regulate and whether it legally encompassed the power to impose a tariff. The highest court in the land has now definitively stated that it does not. They reaffirmed that the power to tax is strictly reserved for Congress, and the president simply lacks the statutory authority to bypass the legislative branch using this specific law. It is also highly notable that Chief Justice Roberts authored this decision himself. While it is standard practice for the Chief Justice to write the opinion for major, consequential cases when he sides with the majority, the makeup of that majority is striking. 3 of the court's most reliably conservative-leaning justices, Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Barrett all firmly sided against the president in this tremendously significant constitutional clash. We are talking about legislation specifically conceptualized to criminalize the fundamental concept of judicial independence. We are witnessing public intimidation campaigns that target individual sitting judges by name, actively directing the unhinged fury of millions of political followers at public servants whose only supposed offense was doing their jobs and applying the law impartially. This is a systematically coordinated effort to completely delegitimize the single branch of the United States government that holds the constitutional authority to look the commander-in-chief in the eye and say no. The president cannot easily do this to Congress, which is a political body that can be manipulated, primaried, financially threatened, and legislatively outmaneuvered. He obviously controls the executive branch directly. Therefore, his ultimate target is the judiciary, the one foundational institution purposefully insulated by the founding fathers from exactly this brand of toxic political pressure. The framers designed it this way because they prophetically understood that a leader would eventually emerge who viewed independent, objective courts not as vital constitutional safeguards, but as frustrating personal obstacles to be destroyed. The critical boundary separating executive ambition and judicial review is not written in flashing lights, nor is it enforced by a physical barrier or a standing army. It is an entirely invisible line, maintained only by the shared, fragile understanding that no branch of American government operates above the others, that no individual possesses dictatorial authority, and that the courts exist specifically to enforce constitutional limits no matter who is currently occupying the resolute desk. The president has aggressively decided that this invisible boundary simply no longer applies to him. This terrifying realization, made deliberately and executed systematically, is actively being translated into concrete legislative proposals and organized mob intimidation, representing a direct, unprecedented assault on the constitutional architecture that has preserved American liberty for over 200 years. Shifting gears to the White House response, breaking news from Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt officially announced that the president would be holding an impromptu press briefing to address this Supreme Court tariff decision at exactly 12:45 p.m. Eastern Time. The timing of that announcement was impeccable, dropping right at noon on the dot. Barring a sudden post on Truth Social, this briefing would be the first official opportunity to hear directly from the president regarding this massive loss. The behind-the-scenes timeline of how the president found out is fascinating. When the Supreme Court's ruling was officially handed down, the president was actually right in the middle of hosting a bipartisan meeting with state governors. According to a White House official who was physically present in the room, the press pool had already been escorted out, meaning there were no cameras rolling when the news broke. An aide discreetly brought a note into the room and handed it to the president. He read the note, absorbed the reality that the Scottish decision had been made not in his favor, and then immediately addressed the gathered governors, stating out loud, "It's disgraceful what the courts have done." That direct quote comes straight from the official who witnessed the moment unfold. Allow me to pull back the curtain and expose the connective tissue here, because the precise timeline of these events is absolutely critical, and it is exactly what the mainstream media complex is failing to clearly identify, document, and present to the American public in a way that reveals the full picture. If you examine these terrifying developments in total isolation, viewing an angry speech today, a proposed piece of extreme legislation tomorrow, or a targeted social media attack against a specific judge, next week it is far too easy to dismiss them individually as the standard, albeit noisy, behavior of a perpetually combative politician blowing off steam. However, when you sequence these events, when you trace the timeline carefully and meticulously connect the dots that the daily news cycle treats as disjointed stories, a terrifyingly coherent pattern emerges that is impossible to explain as coincidence or spontaneous outrage. This is coordinated, this is deliberate, this is a highly calculated strategy. The momentum of this narrative accelerated fiercely as the political calendar shifted, creating a high-stakes atmosphere where the administration felt its grip on power genuinely threatened for the very first time. The president deliberately stood before an assembly of Republican lawmakers in a heavily curated setting meant to project absolute dominance and command total loyalty, and began aggressively making statements regarding the federal judiciary that eclipse anything any sitting president has ever dared to say in modern history. This is where the curtain starts to lift, and what lurks behind it is nothing short of an institutional nightmare. Expanding on the internal White House dynamics, senior officials confirmed that the West Wing was fully aware this outcome was a distinct possibility. For quite some time, the president and his inner circle have been quietly signaling that they have developed a contingency plan to counteract a decision of this sort happening. The administration was supposedly unsurprised by today's outcome and claims to have been preparing for this legal roadblock for months. What we are entirely lacking right now, however, are any substantive, concrete details regarding exactly how they intend to counteract this ruling. The president's fury has been brewing. Just last night, he publicly railed against the Supreme Court, bitterly complaining about how long he had been forced to wait for their decision. In a recorded statement, he complained, "I've been waiting forever, and the language is clear that I have the right to do it as president. I have the right to put tariffs on for national security purposes." Countries that have been ripping us off for years, you know what they're doing using tariffs. What a country. So sad. The president was already incredibly fired up and agitated well before the ruling even dropped. Now, massive questions loom over Washington. First, what becomes of the billions of dollars that American companies have already paid in tariffs under a system that the Supreme Court just declared unconstitutional? Second, what are the actual, specific mechanics of this mysterious counterplan the White House insists they have been developing? Let us revisit that staggering speech he gave to his party. He launched into a vicious tirade that, had it been uttered by literally any previous occupant of the Oval Office, would have instantly triggered a constitutional five-alarm fire, burning across every front page in the country and dominating every news cycle for weeks. He looked directly into the eyes of his most steadfast allies, the very lawmakers who had loyally shielded him through every prior controversy, and he boldly demanded a brand new crime bill. But this proposed legislation was not aimed at combating the fentanyl traffickers poisoning communities across America. It was not designed to target the violent, repeat criminal offenders who make city streets genuinely dangerous for ordinary families. It addressed absolutely none of the genuine, traditional public safety concerns that Republican lawmakers have campaigned on for decades. No, this legislative demand had a shockingly specific, chillingly deliberate target. A target so completely unprecedented in the history of American executive politics that the entire room should have gone cold the moment the words left his mouth. His target was federal judges. He wanted to weaponize the law against the very people who sit on the judicial bench and impartially apply justice, regardless of a defendant's vast political wealth or power. These are the exact individuals the Constitution permanently insulated from political retaliation because the brilliant architects of our republic understood with absolute clarity that an independent judiciary is the ultimate foundation of democratic governance, not an optional luxury. And yet, the President of the United States stood there before his own party and demanded legislation to criminalize the exercise of that very judicial independence. From a purely legal standpoint, examining the monumental decision reveals several fascinating details. The sheer structure of the ruling is remarkable. We are looking at a massive 170-page document that contains 7 distinct, separate opinions written by the 9 members of the court. This complex breakdown means that while a solid 6-justice majority agreed on the final outcome, specifically that IEEPA does not grant the president the legal authority to impose these tariffs, they arrived at that shared conclusion through wildly different legal philosophies and pathways. Reading the ruling is almost like reading a legal choose-your-own-adventure book. The ending is identical, but the jurisprudential journey the justices took to get there varies significantly. Furthermore, this decision stands out as a massive, historic victory not just for the specific plaintiffs who initiated the lawsuit, but for the fundamental authority of Congress as a whole legislative body, even if certain Republican lawmakers refuse to acknowledge it as such. When you examine Justice Gorsuch's concurring opinion, he clearly states that while the phrase regulate importation might be legally ambiguous, it definitively does not equate to the sweeping power to levy taxes. That profound power belongs exclusively to Congress under the Constitution. Gorsuch brilliantly argues that when Congress actually desires to delegate such enormous power to the executive branch, they know how to do it and how to choose the right explicit statutory language. He even included a poignant overture to the legislative process itself, acknowledging that while lawmaking is inherently slow and messy, Congress's exclusive constitutional right to tax and create laws is a foundational pillar of our republic that must be deeply respected. The court is strongly vindicating congressional authority at a strange moment in history, when Congress itself seems deeply hesitant to legislate on its own. While Congress has sporadically pushed back against specific tariffs in the past, the Supreme Court just drew a hard line, stating essentially that implicit authority is not enough. Congress must be entirely explicit if they wish to surrender their taxing power. For context, IEEPA refers to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a piece of legislation originating back in the 1970s. Before we discuss the economic fallout, understand the legal horror of what the president proposed regarding the courts. When he demanded action against these judges, his words were not ambiguous. They were not carefully hedged with the kind of diplomatic language that politicians typically deploy when criticizing the judiciary. There was no softening, no qualification, no acknowledgement that judges are constitutional officers performing a function the founders specifically designed to be independent of presidential preference. He explicitly told the assembled members of Congress that these judges are criminals, that they need to be cracked down on, and that the judicial branch exercising its constitutional authority to rule against the executive is not a feature of American democracy, but a threat to it. Critically, he was not invoking the constitutional remedy that actually exists for addressing judicial misconduct. The impeachment process, which is written directly into the Constitution precisely for situations involving judges who commit genuine high crimes and misdemeanors, was not what he was calling for. What he was calling for was something entirely different, something the founders never contemplated, the Constitution never authorized, and that crosses a line no previous president ever approached. He was absolutely not referring to the standard appellate ladder, the mundane but essential process of appealing an unfavorable ruling to a higher court. That legitimate mechanism exists, functions properly, and is the constitutionally designed way for correcting judicial errors. Every defendant in America has access to it. That is not what he was describing. He was talking about something categorically different. If enacted, his proposal would fundamentally and forever alter the relationship between the executive branch and the independent judiciary meant to check it. The president was actively discussing criminalizing the very act of a judge ruling against him, making it a prosecutable offense, a severe crime, subjecting a federal judge to rigorous investigation, terrifying charges, and actual imprisonment simply for signing a legal order that defies his expressed will. This sinister plot transforms judicial independence into a massive criminal liability, threatening to end a judge's career, freedom, and life, purely because they applied the law equally. When those dictatorial words landed, the resulting silence in that room was a sound that will echo through history books. The vast majority of the Republican lawmakers present did not stand up, did not voice a single objection, and completely failed to remind the commander-in-chief that the Constitution prevents exactly what he was demanding. They sat and they listened, and that silence was its own horrifying answer. Answering the economic questions is incredibly difficult right now, as the fate of the untold billions of dollars in tariffs that have already been paid remains entirely murky. Individual importers will likely be forced to painstakingly sue the government one by one in an attempt to claw back their money. Several businesses have already proactively filed massive lawsuits, and an absolute tidal wave of future litigation is guaranteed. However, recovering those funds is going to be an exceptionally messy and complicated process. The administration has stubbornly indicated that they will try to reimpose tariffs under other authorities, though legal experts agree that alternative statutes will not provide the president with anywhere near the immense flexibility he enjoyed under the emergency law. Consequently, while some targeted tariffs might go forward, many others will likely fail. This chaotic landscape is generating tremendous, paralyzing uncertainty for investors, consumers, and international trade partners. Canada, for example, has already publicly stated that while the majority of its goods are not under tariffs, they do not believe today's Supreme Court decision will have a huge impact on definitively resolving the broader trade war. Ultimately, while today is undeniably historic for asserting the separation of powers, it will not definitively stop global tariffs, nor does it provide a clear path for companies seeking financial reimbursement. We will have to wait and see what other kinds of tariffs stay in effect, or what new ones the administration may impose. The real-world impact is devastating. Earlier this month, the Tax Foundation released a stunning report showing that Trump's tariffs essentially cost the average American household an extra $1,000 last year. Over the course of 2025, we watched in horror as the prices of basic items like coffee and tea skyrocketed almost 12%. Another deeply concerning study revealed that ground beef spiked by a staggering 19%. This decision holds massive weight for the average American when it comes to their pocketbooks. While we calculate the cost of beef and coffee, we must fully grasp the cost of losing our republic. The people whose institutional oath is to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic, said absolutely nothing. They absorbed this direct, documented, openly stated assault on a co-equal branch of government as though it were just another rant about crowd sizes or media bias. They treated the terrifying demand to criminalize judicial independence as simply the background noise of a contentious political moment, rather than acknowledging it as one of the most alarming things any American president has ever said out loud in front of witnesses. This is not hyperbole. This is not dramatic framing designed to generate clicks and outrage. This is a genuine, documented attempt conducted entirely in the open to use the legislative power of the United States Congress as a blunt instrument to bludgeon the judiciary into submission. And because the news cycle is a ravenous beast that consumes itself every 24 hours, this staggering moment was largely swallowed by the next wave of controversies before it could fully penetrate the public consciousness and receive the sustained, serious attention it demands. The context surrounding this demand transforms it into a coherent and genuinely terrifying strategy. This demand for a judge punishment bill did not materialize in a vacuum. It arrived hot on the heels of a stinging, humiliating defeat at the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court, that marble institution where Trump had meticulously placed three of his own ideological allies, dropped a legal anvil on his signature economic policy, ruling the global tariff scheme invalid. The vote was 6-3. Not a nail-biter, not a narrow procedural punt, but a definitive, unequivocal declaration that the president had overstepped his constitutional authority. The majority opinion stated clearly that the president does not possess the unilateral power to remake the global economic order using a vague emergency statute from the 1970s. This was the system working exactly as the framers designed it. The executive branch acted, the judicial branch reviewed, and the judicial branch said, "Stop! That is not how this works." For any president who accepted the fundamental premise of American governance, that would be the end of the road. You appeal, you lose, you pivot to a new legislative strategy. That is how it has always worked. But for a president who operates under the assumption that rules are merely suggestions to be bulldozed, this ruling was not a legal check, it was an act of war. His response was immediate and venomous. He did not hold a press conference expressing disappointment while vowing to respect the court's decision. He took to his digital platform and unloaded on his own appointees. The very justices whose confirmations he had celebrated as historic victories were suddenly reclassified as part of a weaponized deep state apparatus. He accused the court of issuing bad and wrongful rulings, painting the institution not as the neutral arbiter of the law, but as a political hit squad operating specifically to undermine his agenda. This is the crucial psychological and political pivot. By redefining the judiciary as a political enemy, he is creating the moral and rhetorical justification for treating them as one. If they are not impartial guardians of the Constitution, but merely political actors in robes, then why should they be immune from political retaliation? Why shouldn't Congress pass laws to punish these political actors? It is a closed loop of logic that is perfectly coherent only if you first accept the premise that the president is the sole legitimate arbiter of power in American government. Once you accept that premise, anyone who says no to the president is not exercising their constitutional duty, but committing an act of sabotage. And saboteurs in any system are criminals. Now we shift to the judiciary's defensive countermeasures, a narrative that has flown almost entirely under the radar of mainstream coverage. The federal judiciary is a famously reticent institution whose power rests on moral authority and the perception of impartiality. Federal judges generally do not hold press conferences or issue fiery rebuttals to politicians. Their culture is one of monastic restraint, letting written opinions speak for themselves. So when the Judicial Conference, the policy-making arm of the entire federal judiciary, issued formal written guidance stating that judges are now permitted to speak out in measured defense of the court against illegitimate criticism and attacks that undermine judicial independence, it was the institutional equivalent of a fire alarm being pulled in a library. It is the sound of an institution pushed to its breaking point, concluding that silence is no longer an adequate response. The guidance was universally interpreted as a direct green light for judges to push back against the targeted attacks emanating from the White House. Courts were telling their own members that the usual rules of silence no longer apply because the institution is under an unprecedented public assault. And then, as if to punctuate that internal guidance with the force of a gavel, Chief Justice John Roberts stepped into the public square. The Chief Justice, a man who guards the institutional prestige of the Supreme Court with extraordinary care, issued a stark, unambiguous, impossible to misinterpret warning. He stated publicly and on the record that dangerous personal attacks on judges have got to stop. There was no nuance, and no need to read between the lines. The target of the remark was as obvious as sunlight. The head of the judicial branch looked directly at the head of the executive branch and delivered a necessary message. The intimidation campaign is unacceptable, it is dangerous to the republic, and it must stop. That this moment did not dominate the national conversation for a solid week tells you everything you need to know about the state of our information ecosystem. We are so inundated with cascading crises that a direct constitutional warning from the Chief Justice to the sitting president barely registers as a sustained blip. But this is not normal. This is a 5-alarm fire, and the fact that we can barely smell the smoke should terrify us. The judiciary's response is an existential defense. When the Judicial Conference tells judges they can speak out, they acknowledge that the traditional shield of silence is no longer sufficient protection. The attacks are coming from the podium of the White House and the floor of Congress, with the full institutional weight of the executive branch behind them. When Chief Justice Roberts says the attacks have to stop, he is deploying the only tool at his disposal: moral authority. He cannot order federal marshals to arrest the president. He can only speak. The fact that he felt compelled to speak, breaking the tradition of judicial reserve in such a direct manner, signals the judiciary believes it is in a fight for its institutional survival. This is a dispute over whether there will be anyone left to interpret legal doctrines in the future. We must return to the chilling silence on the question of war powers because it is the shadow that gives this story its terrifying depth. The same lawmakers who might privately cheer the Supreme Court for checking executive overreach on trade are conspicuously, almost deafeningly, absent when it comes to checking executive overreach on war. The Constitution could not be clearer. Congress declares war, and the President commands the military. That line has been blurred for decades, but it has never been erased with the kind of explicit, civilization-threatening rhetoric we are witnessing now. The political cost of opposing a president on national security is perceived to be higher than the cost of opposing him on economic policy. It is easier to vote against a tariff on aluminum than an unauthorized bombing campaign. This disparity is the crack in the foundation of any meaningful institutional reawakening. The judiciary is standing up, but will anyone stand up when the next confrontation is about war? That question is not theoretical. It is the next chapter of this story, written in real time. This is the bottom line you need to carry with you. A sitting president of the United States is actively engaged in a campaign to criminalize the federal judiciary. He is doing this out loud, in front of lawmakers, on social media, at political gatherings, without apology or concealment. He is demanding Congress pass laws to punish judges for rulings he does not like. He has attacked his own Supreme Court appointees after they ruled against his expansive claims of executive power, while simultaneously making international threats that legal experts warn would constitute grave breaches of international law. The federal judiciary has been forced out of its reserve and into the open, issuing new ethics guidance, empowering judges to defend themselves publicly. The Chief Justice of the United States has issued a stark, historically significant warning that these attacks must cease. This is not a normal political fight. This is a war for the soul of the constitutional order, a fight over whether the document that has governed this nation for over 2 centuries still means what it says, or whether it has become merely a suggestion. The courts are doing their job, removing the legal foundation from under the president's aggressive power grabs. He cannot stand being told no by people he cannot fire, intimidate, or replace with loyalists. That is the source of his fury, and that fury is aimed directly at the heart of the American rule of law. Stay tuned, because the next time we convene, we will be examining the precise mechanics of what happens when a president decides that a court order is just a piece of paper. That is the line we are approaching, and you need to know what tools remain to stop the country from crossing it. Subscribe now and help us hit 100K.